Good morning and welcome to the 26th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2019. I'll ask everyone in the public gallery to switch off their electronic devices or switch them to silent mode so they do not affect the committee's work. We've received apologies this morning from the convener, Jenny Mara, and I would also like to welcome Edward Mountain, MSP, who's attending for item 2. The first item of business this morning is a decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 3 and 4 in private? Yep. Thank you. Item 2 on the agenda are Section 22 reports, the 2018-19 audits of NHS Highland and NHS Tayside. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning. First of all, Caroline Gardner, Auditor General for Scotland. Fiona Mitchell-Knight, Audit Director. Bruce Crosby, Senior Audit Manager. Lee Johnson, Senior Manager, all from Audit Scotland, and Joanne Brown, Partner at Grant Thornton UK LLP. Auditor General, may I invite you to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. I've prepared these reports under Section 22 of the Public Finance and Accountability Act 2000. With your permission, I'll start with NHS Highland and then move on to NHS Tayside when you're ready for that. This is the second consecutive Section 22 report provided to Parliament on issues of financial sustainability in NHS Highland, and the fourth in 6 years. It sets out NHS Highland's continued difficulty in meeting its financial targets and reaching a financially sustainable position. The report also sets out the organisational and governance problems that NHS Highland faced in 2018-19, including leadership changes and the issues set out in the Sturrock report. In 2018-19, the board delivered £26.6 million worth of savings, but it still required brokerage of £18 million from the Scottish Government to help it achieve financial balance. The board forecasts that brokerage of £11.4 million will be required this year in 2019-20 and a further £6.1 million in 2020-21, with financial balance being achieved in 2021-22. I consider these forecasts to be unrealistic, given NHS Highland's past performance in identifying and achieving savings. NHS Highland's financial difficulties coincide with a time of significant organisational challenge. There have been several changes to the senior management team and the board, together with recruitment difficulties in some key posts. The culture of NHS Highland has also been a focus of concern. The Sturrock report, published in May this year, found that for many people, NHS Highland is a great place to work and there are thousands of well-motivated, caring and supportive staff. But it also found that incidents of bullying or inappropriate behaviour had occurred. In conclusion, given the board's past record in addressing problems and the current leadership and organisational difficulties it faces, I have concerns about the board's capacity to bring about the necessary change. The board will continue to need extra support in 2019-20 to develop and implement their plan to achieve a financially sustainable position and to address the organisational issues it faces. The focus must now be on longer-term sustainable reforms rather than short-term reactive changes. I'm joined today by Joanne Brown, who is the appointed auditor for NHS Highland, and Lee Johnston from Audit Scotland, and between us we'll do our best to answer the committee's questions.
Very grateful, Auditor General. I wonder, members have very cross-cutting questions over both reports this morning, and I wonder if you'd be in a position to make an opening statement on NHS Tayside at this juncture as well.
Certainly. The second Section 22 report, as you say, is on NHS Tayside. It's the fifth consecutive report on that board, highlighting a series of significant concerns covering financial performance and governance issues. The external auditor has highlighted improvements in the board's financial management and governance arrangements in the year, but she reported that more progress is required with the transformation of services to secure the board's financial sustainability. For the last 7 years, the board has required brokerage from the Scottish Government to help it achieve financial balance. In 2018-19, the board delivered £32 million worth of savings, but it still required brokerage of £17.6 million. NHS Tayside has received £67.8 million of brokerage since 2012-13, of which only £4.3 million has been repaid. In October 2018, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport announced that the Scottish Government will not seek to recover the outstanding brokerage at 31st March 2018. The board still has significant financial challenges. The high-level 3-year plan shows the board breaking even by 2021-22. and the board's transformation programme will be key to reducing its cost base. But it has taken longer than anticipated to approve the strategy, and the detailed transformation programme required to deliver the identified level of savings has still to be developed. As at June this year, there was still only limited evidence of sustainable service redesign and transformation. Effective leadership is critical to delivering the transformation required, and several key vacancies are still to be filled. In conclusion, there are still considerable challenges ahead. NHS Tayside continues to have an expensive operating model, and a significant level of brokerage was required during 2018-19. The achievement of a balanced financial position now depends on the successful delivery of the Transforming Tayside Change programme. Alongside the development of detailed plans, NHS Tayside needs to put in place the necessary organisational capacity. My colleagues Fiona Mitchell-Knight and Bruce Crosby head the audit team for NHS Tayside, and again Lee Johnston will provide cross-cutting support for me in answering the committee's questions.
I'm very grateful, Auditor General. I shall ask the first question just in the generality, if I may. When the committee heard from you last year on the Section 22 reports on NHS Highland and NHS Ayrshire and Arran, you told the committee that, and it's a quote, all boards are struggling with balancing the three sides of the triangle: finances, waiting times and quality of care. Can you tell the committee, is this still the case in relation to all health boards?
Yes, Convener. You took evidence from me recently on my report on the NHS in Scotland 2018-19 across the country. And I think in there we were able to set out the evidence of increasing pressures on the finances, but also on boards' ability to deliver the national standards that they're held to account for, and to maintain the quality of care that we all expect when we need the NHS pressures, when we need the NHS. That's partly a result of continuing financial pressure, but just as important is the demographic challenge facing Scotland, with more of us living longer, with the sorts of complex health problems that can't be treated and cured, but instead need long-standing support. And these two boards, I think, are showing particular instances of those pressures, but they do affect the health service across the country.
Many thanks. Colin Beattie.
Convener, Auditor General, as the Convener said in his opening remarks, there are cross-cutting issues here, and I suppose the one that concerns me really most is the leadership one. And it seems to be a very common thread here, both in NHS Tayside and in NHS Highland, that there is difficulties in retaining, it would appear, the right calibre of staff, of identifying the right calibre of staff, and I'm talking here at a senior level. The non-executives, there seems to be a problem getting the right mix of non-executives as well. And I'm concerned also because this seems to actually not just be confined to NHS Tayside and NHS Highlands, but seems to be across the whole NHS at the moment, with people double bunking on jobs and goodness knows what else. Where are we going on this? What's the solution?
You're right, it is a challenge in both of these boards and in the NHS more widely. Again, it was one of the major themes in the NHS in Scotland report that I brought to the committee recently. We are seeing it increasingly difficult not just to retain but to recruit, to attract people to these jobs. Partly I think it's because the jobs themselves are getting harder, and we see evidence of some people at sort of second tier or within the management of organisations wondering whether it's worth taking that extra step with the profile and the exposure that brings, the responsibilities that it brings with it. Here in Scotland we do tend to pay less for those roles than the NHS in England does, which can make it harder to recruit people in externally.
Interrupt there and ask, is the pay difference significant?
Lee, I think you're on top of this in terms of the detail.
I'd have to, obviously different positions are different. I'd have to look at the detail for you. Certain positions there is some difference. Although we have been successful recently, as you may know, NHS Shetland, NHS Highland and Tayside were all people recruited from down south. But I think the other thing I would just bring into this is, again, we've mentioned it many times, the committee is Project Lift, and that Scottish Government programme to try and manage talent coming through the system and provide better appraisal and better support to the leaders and senior people already in place to try and retain, but also find the leaders of the future as well.
Is this shortage restricted to Scotland, or is it across the UK? Is it a common problem, getting the level of talent you need?
We don't have the level of detail about the NHS in other parts of the UK as we have for Scotland, obviously. I think that sense of stretch and of difficulty recruiting and retaining people is a common one, and exacerbated in some ways in Scotland by the remoteness and rurality of some parts of the NHS that we're recruiting to. There's no doubt that it's a challenge. That's not to say, as Lee has said, that the government isn't doing some things to counter it, but we are seeing significant levels of vacancy across the NHS, and some of them quite long-standing.
I mean, clearly, given the history of NHS Tayside and NHS Highlands, it's a bit like a poisoned chalice, isn't it? I mean, how do you persuade someone to come in and take over that and run it when the risk is so high?
It certainly does bring its own challenges. As Lee said, we have seen new appointments in both boards over the last year, and those people will need support to be able to do what are very significant jobs, a lot of transformation required, and no likelihood of short-term improvements. These are changes that will take a significant amount of time.
Well, let me latch on to the short-term improvements. Let me talk about NHS Highland. They're having trouble recruiting key posts. Given the situation, what options do they actually have to provide that stability and the capacity that they need to move NHS Highlands forward? Because it's not going to happen without that, is it?
I'll ask Joanne to talk you through where they are as the appointed auditor to NHS Highland.
So in terms of the NHS Highland leadership team, they were running with a number of interim posts, and over 18-19 and into early 19-20, those have now been recruited on a permanent basis, including a permanent HR and OD director and the medical director, and they are 100% NHS Highland only roles. The one area NHS Highland is still struggling with is the recruitment of a permanent director of finance. And as the report sets out, they have tried unsuccessfully on 2 occasions to recruit to that post. To support NHS Highland in this, they're obviously at level 4 of the Scottish Government escalation framework. And as part of that support, Scottish Government have put in place a finance turnaround director for the next 12 months to support NHS Highland. But it is recognised that Director of Finance will be a really key role to help ensure stability and delivery of the transformation programme, and that is a post that they've recently re-advertised and are hoping to fill this side of Christmas if possible.
The report says that NHS Highland was the pilot for a review of governance in NHS boards, but that there was limited progress in a number of areas. Maybe you can describe some of the areas where there has been limited progress in this, and if possible, why?
Yes, NHS Highland was the subject of the first review under the new Blueprint for Governance, which is a peer review process, and their review was led by the chair of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, John Brown, back in 2017, I think. I'll ask Joanne to talk you through the progress that's been made since then.
So following the pilot and then the recent survey in February 19, the board have an action plan around good governance, which includes 14 actions, of which 4 they've completed and done, 4 is work in progress, and 6 they've not yet started looking at. Part of the circumstance for that was recognising the appointment of the new chief exec, with the chief exec only starting in February of this year, along with the change in the interim board and the chair of the board. The areas they recognise they still need to focus in on include risk management, particularly risk management at a strategic level, and looking at how they look to mitigate those strategic risks, and as a board better understand risk management and their role around that, alongside considering the governance structure in place and looking again at the Finance Committee as a subcommittee and looking at the flow of information around the committees and through to the board. There has been a delay, partly down to the change in the interim board chair and the recruitment of 3 new non-exec positions to the board, which were filled in July. But the board recognise that this action plan is really important, and they have set actions out to progress the 14 actions and deliver them by the end of the financial year. That's obviously something we'll look at as part of this year's external audit in terms of the progress, because it's critical they get their governance right.
Just Two last questions. One is, with NHS Tayside, these two additional non-executive posts were added due to significant workload. What was the significant workload that triggered that? In other words, is it just a case of they didn't have enough non-executive directors per se? Or has there been, because of this transformation, has there been additional workload put onto the board? And are they properly equipped to do this? Are we getting the right non-executives in?
I'll ask Fiona to come in a moment. The initial increase in the size of the NHS Tayside board, I think, was a response to the scrutiny from this committee and the audit findings about the level of challenges they were facing. You'll recall the questions about the endowment funding, the NHS-wide IT funding, and the other challenges the board was facing. Fiona, can you pick up the detail of the question?
Yes, so it's right, it was in response to the scale of the challenges and the extent of the transformation required and the workload and the expertise that requires from the non-executives. The two extra posts remain vacant currently, so they have not been filled, but that's an ongoing recruitment campaign. The board, as part of its review of its governance arrangements through the review, through the blueprint, identified support of non-executive directors an area for improvement, and the board has been taking some actions to improve its support and development for those members of the board.
How long have they been trying to fill these two posts?
Since the additional posts were approved, Bruce.
Which was...
Yeah, it's in excess of a year now. Yeah.
Sorry, say that again?
It's in excess of a year.
In excess of a year. So
been...
in excess of a year, they've not been able to identify two non-executive posts. That's not very encouraging.
Of the calibre required, as you say, these are, any health board is a significant governance responsibility. These two boards, by their nature, have got significant challenges, and you're right, it is a concern that it's hard to recruit and keep non-execs of the quality required to do those jobs.
Just one last question for both NHS Tayside and NHS Highland. Given where they are at the moment with their senior management and with their non-executives, are they actually in a position to move forward and implement the changes that are needed? Do they have the skills at this time to be able to do that?
I hope the message that's coming across from the two Section 22 reports is that they both face significant challenges. In my view, NHS Tayside is starting to show signs of progress. We have seen some real improvements in their financial management and governance, and the high-level plan looks to be in the right place. I think NHS Highland has more challenges ahead, simply because the scale of the challenge that it needs to address, and the fact that most of its responses so far have been short-term and reactive rather than that longer-term strategic look.
Thank you. Alex Neil.
Can I just follow up on some of these themes? Is the time, when you look at your reports on the NHS, including the Section 22s, including Highland and Tayside, a theme running through it is the managerial weaknesses at every level in the National Health Service in Scotland. Has the time not come for a fairly fundamental review at national level of all aspects of the management of the National Health Service in Scotland? You know, we have 22 NHS boards, 15 of them covering territorial areas, including Highland and Tayside. Do we need 15 directors of finance in this day and age of the computer? Do we need 15 HR departments, not to mention all this backup at St Andrew's House, etc., etc., etc.? Do we not really need... I mean, this is a huge overhead, which, if we could save in that huge administrative overhead, would free up some resource to go into medical and healthcare provision. Is there not time for a very fundamental look at the whole structure?
I think that's a question that you've asked me regularly since you joined the committee, Mr Neil, and I'm afraid my response is going to be similar to the response in previous years. First of all, the structure for the NHS is a matter for government rather than for me as Auditor General. I do think, though, and I've said this to the committee before, that having the number of bodies that we do makes it harder to recruit, retain, develop the number of really high calibre people to do the jobs that are required. Running a health board is difficult in any circumstances, but at a time when the financial pressures are acute and when we really do need to see that transformation to meet the needs of an ageing population, we need to make sure we're making the best use of the people with the skills and experience and capacity to do that.
But if we don't modernise the model of delivery, we could be sitting here in 10 years' time having these same conversations. In fact, the situation might be even worse.
I wouldn't characterise management necessarily as being simply an overhead. I think good management, good governance is important to any organisation, and especially these. But I do think you're right, that it's important we make sure we're using those people in the right places and that jobs are big enough to give them the levers to make the changes that are needed, but not so big that people are just overwhelmed by the pressures.
Yeah.
I think it is entirely appropriate as an area for the committee to explore with government about how we get that balance right.
Right. Can I just look at both Highland and Tayside, because one of the common themes between the two reports is, if you actually look at the appendices in both reports, looking at performance against non-financial standards, actually their performance isn't that bad compared to the Scottish average. I mean, although Highland have been very poor on the overall treatment time guarantee, 54% against a national average of 68%, against a national target of 95%. When you look at the 12 weeks first outpatient appointment, cancer treatments, CAMS provision and so on, actually in many of these they're actually exceeding performance both in terms of targets and the average for Scotland as a whole. And similarly with Tayside, when it comes to the delivery of healthcare, I mean, Tayside, as has been the case for about 10 years, is one of the best, still, despite the challenges, one of the best performing boards on A&E turnaround times at 96%. So it seems to be that if you look at this, while there are areas in terms of healthcare delivery that clearly need to be improved, a lot of the problems are not in the day-to-day delivery of healthcare. Despite all the challenges, they're actually not doing that badly, you know, and many areas doing very well, actually. So it seems to me that a lot of the problems are in, if you like, the non-health, frontline health side, as we've been discussing. But there must come surely a point where the problems of management start to adversely impact the performance on the delivery of healthcare. Are we near that point in either of these boards?
First of all, I think you're absolutely right that if you look at the performance of these two boards against the national standards, they aren't doing badly at all. I think last year NHS Highland met 6 of the 18 national standards, NHS Tayside met 5 across the country. I think only 2 were met across Scotland as a whole last year, so they're significantly above that. In a sense, I think it comes back to the opening question from the convener this morning, that we tend to see the sort of triangle of standards, finances and the quality of care. And if people are achieving well on one, there's pressure on another, that you get that movement through it. These boards undoubtedly have had some challenges around their governance and management, which we've reported on in previous years. I think there has been a concern across the NHS that a focus on achieving financial performance and clinical standards can put pressure on staff, which makes it harder to continue doing that longer term. And as I said in my NHS in Scotland report, those standards tend to focus on what's happening in acute hospitals. So getting those right can mean that people aren't investing enough time and effort and focus on developing those community-based, primary-based services that can not only relieve the pressure on acute hospitals and the staff who work there, but also provide better care to people with continuing health problems and people who are simply needing more support because they're older. That's why I think pulling that lens back from simply what's happening on the national standards is so important. We include those as one element of context, but it's not the only thing that we're focusing on in our reports on these boards or the NHS as a whole.
Can I specifically ask about NHS Highland? Because NHS Highland, is a completely different model from any other territorial health board in Scotland, in that health and social care are run by NHS Highland on behalf of NHS Highland and Highland Council. So it doesn't have an integrated joint board. Is there any evidence that that model is working better or worse than the integrated joint board model?
I'll ask Joanne to come in a moment, but I think there's certainly evidence that that lead agency model, where the health board is responsible for providing social care as well as healthcare to older people, is one of the factors that's increasing the financial pressures on the board. Joanne, can you pick that question up?
So one of the things NHS Highland are looking at is that lead agency model, the integration that sits underneath that, and looking at that again with Highland Council, with a view to reviewing that by the end of the financial year. Part of the pressure NHS Highland is facing is the increasing challenge and demand on adult social care, alongside the current lead agency model, which is based on a fixed financial sum of funding flowing from the council to the NHS board. Therefore, any increase in demographics or pressure on that service has to be financially met by NHS Highland. Both parties recognise the benefit of the model they have in place. They also recognise that financially they need to look at that, and they also need to look at the governance structures that sit alongside that in order to really focus in on improved outcomes. And there is examples they do have where, because the service is run all by NHS Highland, that they can show that patients were treated quicker and the right solutions were treated and happened faster. But they recognise there's a lot more that needs to still be done around that model and improving the outcome and how close they both work together.
So from what you say, Joanne, is there underfunding because of the fixed nature of the money that's effectively coming in for social care?
So I think that's something that obviously the NHS board would probably be better placed to answer. But NHS...
Phrase it in a way that you can answer it. If you look at the percentage increase in demand for social care, for which NHS Highland is responsible for meeting that demand, if you looked at a percentage increase in the demand for social care services vis-à-vis an increase in the resources being made available overall for NHS Highland, is there a bigger gap there than there would be in the other IGB boards?
So it's difficult to comment in terms of the other IJB boards, but if you looked at it in that cold financial perspective, then you would say that it looks like that is underfunded, and that would be NHS Highland's argument around that and how they work with the council. There is obviously taking into account a balance there around how well the service is run. Is there efficiencies in there? Is there additional financial savings that could be achieved? And it links to the wider challenge NHS Highland have of identifying the savings and then delivering on them. But if you looked at it in a cold way, then NHS Highland would say that that model currently stands means that they face all the risks and challenge in the increasing financial spend and demographics.
Yeah, but it's not inherent in the model per se that the funding for social care should be frozen. That's not a requirement of the model. That must have been a decision taken elsewhere.
So that's both organisations are comfortable with the model. They just are looking at the financial arrangement that underpins the model. So when the model was set up 5 years ago, it was set up in a certain way. Obviously, over time, things have changed, pressure on that service has changed, the setup, the healthcare needs are changing, and that's why both parties are reviewing that model, particularly the financial aspect, by the end of this financial year.
And I mean, obviously, Highland is a huge area covered by Highland Health Board and Highland Council. Is there any evidence that there needs to be additional funding in respect of the additional cost of delivering services in such a sparse area? I mean, obviously you get a concentration of population in Inverness, but the further you go out from Inverness, the more sparse the population is divided, and clearly it takes a lot more money per head to deliver in rural areas than it does in Inverness itself or in any other city.
It's something that I don't have the information to hand to answer. What I would say is both the Highland Council Chief Exec and the NHS Highland Chief Exec meet at least weekly and meet on a frequent basis, and part of those discussions do reflect the remote rural nature of the Highlands and the join up of both council and NHS services to basically support the NHS Highlands plans around community development, community hospitals. So they are working quite closely together to look at some of the specific challenges the Highland area brings. But I can't specifically answer the financial side of that. That's probably something the NHS board would be better placed to answer.
Okay.
The funding formulae for both NHS boards and for local government are intended to take account of rurality and remoteness. You'll know that there's a continuing debate about whether there's enough on that side as opposed to the additional demands that come from greater deprivation, for example, in Greater Glasgow. That's a continuing conversation.
Yes.
On that point, can I ask just a very blunt question? Do you get any sense that the lead agency model, all things being equal, is the lead agency model a better deliverer of the outcomes that we're all looking for as against the IJB model, do you think?
We've reported on integration and on IJBs 3 times, I think, now since they were set up in legislation, and we've never come to quite that conclusion. There are some integration authorities that are working very well and some that are making much less progress, and they are all under the sorts of pressures that we're talking about here. My personal view is that if people get it right, the lead agency model has got the virtue of simplicity, that you're building on the bodies that are already in place, and where it works, it tends to be working on good working relationships, as Joanne's described in Highland. But we haven't had enough evidence yet to conclude that that is the case based on the way the policy's been implemented across the country yet, partly because of the slow progress that's been made.
Understand. Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much. Convener, I think I'd just, at the beginning, just like to put on record that there is a great work going on in both these boards by the staff. We always focus on the problems and the issues at the committee, but I think it's important to recognise the quality of work that's going on in delivering healthcare in these 2 boards, Convener. And looking at both their performance, financial performance so far, they have made some progress in this. Caroline, you've mentioned that Highland have managed to identify £26 million of recurring savings, and Tayside have managed to identify £21 million of recurring savings. So we have to note that and give credit to that. But where I wanted to look at with you was the areas of cost overspends that you've mentioned for both the boards, and you've got 2 pieces of information in your reports, page 9 on the Highland report and on page 10 on the Tayside report. It's just to try to drill in a little bit more with you about the reasons behind some of these. Now, for a number of years, Convener, we've been seeing all of the health boards overspending on drug cost, prescription costs and so on and so forth. We hear it all the time. What's going on here, do you think? Did we just get the forecasts wrong? Did the drug companies just increase the price and don't tell the boards? Do we not have an all Scotland-wide procurement policy for purchasing drugs? What do you think is the reason behind that one in particular? Why do we always seem to get this wrong, and why are both Highland and Tayside suffering as a result of that?
There's a lot going on there, and I'll kick off, and I'm sure colleagues may want to add to it, particularly in relation to the individual boards. First of all, drug costs tend to increase as a quantum anyway, because new drugs are discovered that can treat new conditions or treat existing conditions better. When they are new, they tend to attract very premium prices because they're within patent, and we have seen, as members will know, very sort of financially driven behaviour by people buying up existing drug companies and hiking the prices where they think they can do that. It's very live at the moment in discussions about future trade deals. So the drug cost inflation tends to be higher than general inflation anyway. Beyond that, the people who prescribe, particularly in primary care, are individual doctors. They will follow their own practice, their preferences, their views on what's the most appropriate for a patient. The NHS as a whole and individual boards have done a lot recently to bring back that variation, to encourage people to prescribe generic drugs or bioidentical drugs, to give them information that shows how they compare with their peers with similar practice populations, and bring outliers back down towards the average prescribing practice of GPs. And we've seen some real improvements on that across the country and in these boards as well. We're also seeing more support through things like board-employed pharmacists who will work with GPs to really help them think about polypharmacy, people who are receiving 5 or 6 or more prescriptions and how they relate to each other and whether they're actually doing more good than harm, or whether you can make savings by improving prescribing. So lots going on. I'll ask Joanne and then Fiona to talk you through what we've seen in the 2 individual boards here and why the cost pressures are the way they are.
So I think from the perspective of NHS Highland, looking at drug costs, that's something they've put into their transformation programme and much more focus around in terms of having a better control of the spend against the budget. Looking as well at, is that budget that they set at the start of the year a realistic budget? So effectively building on the Auditor General's points, one of the things NHS Highland are looking to do going forward is to really focus in on lessons learned from other boards and look at alternative practices that are being applied and working successfully in other boards to see how they can introduce that into NHS Highland to start to take the spend as far as possible and the overspend as far as possible around drug costs down.
Reiterate what has been already said. And NHS Tayside similarly have a focus on prescribing costs as part of their transformation activity. And whilst 18-19 we were reporting on the overspend, we're seeing some promising signs in the outturn for the 2019-20 spend position that prescribing costs are actually underspent. So there's some promising signs that some of that work is starting to have an impact.
Okay, that's kind of good and mixed there, but is the basic model that the costs come from the bottom up? The GPs can decide which drugs to prescribe right across the 2 boards, and effectively that cost just reaches the top? Or is there a budget set aside and we try to procure the same drugs across the board? What way does it work really? Is it bottom up or top down?
GPs, all doctors are entitled to prescribe the drugs they think are most appropriate, and I guess we would all want that to continue to be the case. The NHS does a lot of work nationwide to put in place procurement contracts that give people access to the best prices that can be achieved, and to use the buying power of the NHS across Scotland. So the difference is more in the prescribing practice of individual doctors, GPs, but also doctors in hospital for what they prescribe in terms of the cost of the items and the volume of items that they prescribe. So the bottom up is really important, and that's why this support through pharmacy support, through providing national information, through sitting down and talking to GPs about why their prescribing might differ from somebody else's is so important. It's also true to say that I think in NHS Tayside prescribing has historically been more expensive than in most of the rest of Scotland because of both the number of items prescribed and the cost of those items.
Okay, Alec, I think, covered some of the additional demands and social care costs, particularly in Highland, but there's a number of items, Caroline, in the Tayside report that could draw your attention to. There's some additional cost overruns in there, £4.4 million in corporate services. You've mentioned they're due to overspends and the costs of patients referred out with the Tayside area. Could you explain what the reason behind that is, please?
I'm not sure we can tell you very much more about it, but I'll ask Fiona to give you what information we have got.
We don't have much information on the detail of that. All that I would say is that in terms of the transformation programme, that the review of the clinical strategy and the approach to delivering care is obviously a priority, and that's one of the areas that will be built into that activity.
Yeah, I think we might want to follow through with that one, convener, just to drill in a bit more there. Finally, I just wanted to ask you a similar question I asked last week. When we were talking about Ayrshire and Arran and the interventions by Scottish Government and others to help turn that around, is that happening in these 2 boards?
Yes.
And is it beginning to bear fruit and show some signs of success?
Yes, both boards are currently at level 4 in the intervention framework. I think Tayside has been at level 5 and has come back down to level 4. They both have support coming in from Scottish Government. I wonder if Lee, you can summarise that for Mr. Coffey.
Yes, I guess Fiona and Joanne might be better placed to give the detail, but there has been external support, both in terms of secondments from Scottish Government themselves to offer day-to-day support in the financial turnaround, but also in terms of external consultancy, particularly I think in NHS Highland. Obviously, Tayside for a time also had the Assurance and Advisory Group and the Transformation Support Programme there to help them, and they outlined a number of different areas, 11 or 12 different areas, and their last report did look at the progress that Tayside had made against their recommendations, and it was all quite encouraging. But I don't know if Fiona or Joanne would like to add.
No, I mean, I think from NHS Highland, one of the key areas of support from Scottish Government's been through turnaround directors, 2 for a period of time up to the end of July, and then 1 now on a full-time basis through to the end of the financial year to really support the financial turnaround. On top of that, there's been some additional support from Scottish Government to support the board in their development in terms of their development around values and good governance, and that's something Scottish Government are also working with the board on as well.
Lastly there, Convener, I see in paragraph 32, Caroline, on the Tayside report, there's been something like 5 or 6 new directors appointed. Is that within the mix of this intervention that we're talking about here, or has that happened separately to that piece of work?
There have been new appointments separate from the support that we've been talking about, partly because of the scrutiny that the board has been under and the turnover that resulted from that. If you'd like more detail, I think Fiona can give you a sense of the changes that we've made.
Yep.
Yes, so following the appointment of the current chief executives, that was in November 2018, there was a review of the senior officer structure, and some of those vacancies were a new post through that structure, but there are also vacancies in existing roles. What I would say is, since we wrote this report, there has been some progress and some key roles have been filled. So a permanent chair has now been appointed, and new medical directors and nursing directors have been identified. So there is some progress, but there are key vacancies in a couple of key posts, including the deputy chief executive and the permanent director of finance. So things have moved on, but still to do.
Okay, right. Thanks for that, Convener.
Thank you. A couple of points I'd like to briefly pick up on. This committee reported on NHS Tayside in May and said that there was a lot still to be done. Now, of course, NHS Tayside has an assurance and advisory group which was set up. But you conclude in the report, Auditor General, that the plans for transformation remain very high level. So can we be reassured that this AAG, this group, is delivering? And are you reassured that the Scottish Government is providing the right type and level of support to get through this?
The team will keep me straight, but the Assurance and Advisory Group completed its work earlier this year, I think in May this year, and was stepped down at that stage. We make a reference in the report to its final findings, and they're very similar to ours, that some of these first steps have been taken, but the real challenging job of detailing the plans and delivering them is what remains to be done. It was useful support, I think, in identifying where the problems and the opportunities are for NHS Tayside, and starting the clinical conversation about how the changes that are needed can be made, but that work still remains to be done to deliver it.
And briefly, just if I may go back to this lead agency model, just so I understand something, presumably there is an exposure under the lead agency model to council. If there is a cut to funding to the council, then that exposes the lead agency in a way that the IJB model wouldn't. Is that correct?
Not quite sure it is. Joe will keep me straight on this, but I think under the agreement that's in place in Highland, the amount of funding that comes from the council to the Health Board for Adult Social Care was set at the beginning. So whatever happens to Highland Council's funding, it's committed to providing that much funding to the NHS. And whatever happens to demand, the NHS is committed to providing the services that are required. That's why in this case, the financial pressures are on the Health Board. In other IJ IJBs, we've seen exactly what you describe, councils feeling that their funding is under pressure and feeling able to commit less to the IJB budget, and the tensions coming through in other ways. What's important to remember, I think, is that the system is under pressure for health and social care, particularly for older people across the country.
Understand, thank you. Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. Morning. If I can return to the governance aspects again and touch on the audit committees. I'll ask some questions first about Highland, but then maybe the same ones will flow through to Tayside. We've had issues with audit committees in the past, Scottish Police Authority, and more recently, and surprisingly to me, the Scottish Government. And here again, your report is stating that the audit committee in Highland was not as effective as it should be in supporting effective scrutiny and challenge. And also that there were, I think, 102 internal audit recommendations that were overdue. Can you give us a little bit of background as to what's going on there?
Joanne's well placed to do that.
So one of the challenges that the Audit Committee have and have started to recognise is about the quality and the timing of the information they receive as a committee to allow them to do that effective challenge and scrutiny, and to get the balance right in terms of the overarching bigger picture and not stray into the operational detail. So one of the examples the Audit Committee were struggling with was often the sub-group on risk would do a verbal update on risk instead of an actual risk management paper to allow them to scrutinise and understand the risk management position. That was something that was flagged in the governance review as one of the actions. One of their challenges is, over a period of time, the number of outstanding internal audit recommendations has grown and gone past the due date. And one of the things the committee have been slower to do is to hold the executive team to account for the delivery of those actions. And the executive team themselves haven't necessarily owned the actions in place and had an oversight of the delivery of those actions. So although that's something they have recognised, progress in that area is still slow. But the Chief Exec has committed with the senior management team to reduce that level as far as practical by the end of the financial year. And that's something we'll obviously look at as part of our audit this year.
The performance of the audit committee is not necessarily due to what comes to them. They themselves, I think, should be in the driving seat. Can you tell me, are there any auditors on the audit committee? And also, how independent is the audit committee? Are they independent of the public sector? Are they people who work for other public sector agencies?
So in terms of the audit committee membership, the chair of the audit committee has a financial background. I'd have to check whether he was financially qualified, but does have a financial background. And at the start of every meeting, he declares a link between himself and Highland Council. He's a councillor for Highland Council. The other individuals on that audit committee don't have a governance or risk management or financial background, and that's something that the audit committee, along with the board, are looking to develop their skills on. The other member of the committee, up until relatively recently, was the employee director, and that's now been changed to one of the new non-executive members that's come in to try and strengthen the skills within that committee. But it is recognised that the committee itself would benefit from more experience, particularly around risk management and financial management.
Now, I had a quick look back on the minutes just to see some of the names, and they seem to have been the same for some period of time. And the way you describe it, no disrespect to them, I'm not slightly surprised that perhaps there are problems in the committee. And it's also a little bit strange that if you're in this lead model situation, that you have a councillor who's from the council being the chief person on the the committee that's meant to challenge what goes on.
So in terms of the chair of the audit committee and the link between himself and Highland Council, that chair of the audit committee was appointed through the public audits appointment process, and that's not a dual role. It's not a role he's on because of his link with Highland Council. He came through the public appointment process. The members of that committee have been members of that committee for a while, and one of the things the board did recognise when they had 3 non-exec vacancies was the need for slightly different skills, not just within the audit committee but at the board itself. And the recruitment of these 3 new non-execs has allowed them to move some of those audit committee members round to get a different skill and perspective onto that committee. But there is still something about audit committee training for those members that are there.
Can I ask the Auditor General what her view on this is from perhaps a bigger perspective?
We've talked in this committee before about the challenge of recruiting enough people of the right skills and experience to public body boards in general. You will know, Mr Bowman, that audit committee skills can be in particularly short supply. That's not the case in just the public sector, but in the corporate world as well. And it's obviously one of the really important checks and balances within a good governance system. It's one of the reasons why our auditors look at it and why we report on it when there's a problem.
So what do you do in the short term when you know there's a problem with an audit committee in terms of perhaps the makeup to try and make it more effective?
The starting point is the work of the appointed auditor, and all appointed auditors will be working with the board, with the audit committee chair on some of these issues. We do provide more general training and support to board members and to audit committee members as part of the work that Audit Scotland does across the piece. And when things go wrong, the route I have is to bring it to this committee to ask questions of government about the work that it's doing to appoint and support people responsible for governance.
And in general, having someone who's a chair, who's also a councillor, even if it's come through a particular route, does that sit well with you?
I think it's worth remembering, first of all, that by statute now all health boards include some local authority representatives. That in itself throws up some questions both about the size of the board and about what people think they are there to do, whether they're there as a board member or as a representative of another organisation. I agree with you, there's a particular set of questions where the lead agency is in place, as it is in Highland. In formal terms, as Joanna said, the chair of the audit committee declares that interest each time, but particularly when times are challenging, as they are just now, I think there are questions about whether more separation might be helpful.
So if we move then to Tayside, the same question there then. Are there any auditors on the audit committee, and are the members independent of the public sector?
Just to say, quite a different situation to Highland, so there's been quite a lot of change in the audit committee at Tayside over the last year or so. There's a new chair in place, and the focus of the audit committee has changed, so it's now an audit and risk committee, so quite a change in how it's operating. With the amount of change, the board has recognised it needed to provide support, and so has looked at its induction arrangements and its support for those members. Bruce, could you maybe say a little bit about the background of the chair of the audit committee?
Not so much the chair. He doesn't come from a local government background, so I don't think we've got any concerns in that respect. But in terms of the financial expertise, I think there was concerns voiced about the financial expertise within the audit committee previously, but they have brought on some financial expertise to the committee, so they've got a couple of members who have got that expertise and bringing that to bear in quite a good informed fashion across the NHS Tayside Audit Committee.
So the question is, are there any auditors on the committee?
No.
And
audit background.
And in terms of independence from the public sector?
I'd have to come back to you on that one. I can't recall it.
We're not aware of any conflicts there, and in the same way that Highland, you know, if there were issues that it would need to be declared at the meetings, and the meetings structured in that way for people to declare interests.
So when we were speaking earlier about appointing board members and these 2 extra places, but you said there have or there haven't filled up these complements now? They haven't. So we're in the situation again of talking about what needs to be done, but we're functioning at the moment perhaps without the resources we need.
As Bruce has said, there has been some change on the audit committee membership and there's some financial expertise, but as we said in response to an earlier question, the government hasn't been able to fill those 2 additional non-exec posts yet, and I think it's very fair to say that it is difficult to recruit people to the range of public bodies with the skills and experience that are needed, and particularly with an audit committee background. That's not only a public sector issue.
Just one final aspect then. If you're doing your audits and you don't have a board that you believe has all the requisite skills and an audit committee that may not have the requisite skills, do you then change your approach in terms of the work that you do?
we would certainly report that as part of our annual audit, but we would also, as the Auditor General has said, discuss that with the chair of the Audit Committee and make them aware of our concerns. And we do provide support in terms of understanding roles for members to help with that.
Then it cannot be what you would want it to be. Therefore, I presume you have to adjust and do more work.
So I suppose one of the things we would consider is things like management override of controls. So typically we would think about that from a financial controls perspective and things like management override in journals. I think as part of that risk, as auditors, we then think about the control environment in the organisation, and would that help management potentially override wider controls because of poorer governance, and factor that in terms of our approach and our challenges, how we do our planning. But I would just obviously also reiterate Fiona's points around how we escalate these issues to, in this case, obviously the Chief Exec and the Interim Chair of the Board, but also how we look to support, in particular, things like the Audit Committee strengthen through our reporting.
I don't think we would be required to change our audit approach, because I think that our view is that we would have reported any concerns we had about the Audit Committee, and I don't think, in my opinion, that the Audit Committee is performing badly. I think it's it's an effective Audit Committee. I think it's well chaired. I think they respond well to reports that go to it. I think they ask the right questions. So overall, I think that the NHS Tayside Audit Committee is working effectively.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Mountain, do you wish to come in at this point?
I was going to come in at the end, Convener, when all your committee members have had a chance to speak. I'm very conscious of being on another committee that committee members don't appreciate.
I was asking questions about culture, but I realise it's a local issue for you, so I'm happy for you to go first, Edward.
It's not really about culture, Convener. It's really about management of finances.
I think that would be relevant now, unless Anna says anything.
Okay. Caroline, good morning. I've read your report. You highlight leadership instability. You highlight no effective action by the Audit Committee in NHS Ireland. You highlight poor risk management. You highlight the fact that we've got external consultancy coming in, which is going to contribute to 10% of the overspend of NHS Ireland this year anyway. You have said this morning that you think their predicted balance of budget in 21-22 is unrealistic. Where do you think they're going to be?
Joe may want to come in a moment. What we don't recalculate, if you like, the forecasts that public bodies put together of their financial positions. Our interest is in making sure they are doing that long-term planning and in testing how robust it is, whether they've thought about all the things that might happen and looked at different scenarios. You're right, I say in my report that I think given the lack of detail in some of the plans and their past record of achieving savings and making change, the prospect of achieving balance by 2021-22 is unrealistic. I'm not in a position to tell you what I think the position will be at that stage. Joe, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think I would add, in terms of 18-19, they are, as an organisation, slightly further on in their journey around financial transformation. So I think in 18-19 we have seen some improvements in that long-term financial plan. We've seen them be able to submit the details to Scottish Government, and we can see that underpinning the savings programmes, there are a series of programmes and actions in place. I think one of the challenges will be the delivery of that programme and taking that programme from the paper into actual savings, and culturally, how do they get the organisation all behind that and deliver that, and do those savings get delivered per plan? And that's something you can't obviously determine. The plans are better, but actually what their biggest challenge now is taking that and delivering on those.
I mean, my comment is to make a comment, and I know you're very careful in your comments, to say it's unrealistic. You must have an estimate in your mind on why it's unrealistic. One of the things that NHS Highland has been particularly bad doing, in all my knowledge of them, which is over many years, is finding recurring savings. They're very good at finding non-recurring savings, cutting with a sharp knife, which for 1 year and then not following it through. Would that be your view as well?
Yes, we say in the report that last year they planned to achieve just over £50 million worth of savings. Of those planned savings, they achieved 26.6 million, so just over half of the savings they planned. That is a pattern we've seen over a number of years. That difficulty is obviously increased if you don't have a full and effective leadership team in place, and if you don't have the detailed plans for how your savings are going to be achieved. Just one example, I think for 2019-20, most of the savings that are planned are expected to be achieved towards the back end of the year. Now, for auditors, that's always a warning sign. You expect people to have a steady plan during the year for how they're going to be able to achieve savings, rather than it always being that little bit further out. That's the reason for the finding in the report that I think the current forecast for 2021-22 financial balance is unrealistic.
And one more question, if I may, Convener, is having spoken to people who met with PwC on part of this project management office that's being set up. They were less than enthusiastic, the people on the ground. Are you enthusiastic with what's been achieved by PwC in their project management office setup? Is it worth £1 million plus, including VAT? That it's going to cost?
That's clearly a lot of money, and I can absolutely understand the concern in Highland about the amount being spent on the project management office and management of the changes rather than on healthcare services. I say in the report that it's too early to comment on whether it's value for money, but it's definitely something that Joanne will be looking at in this year's annual audit report, and my successor, I'm sure, will report back to this committee on.
So, sorry, Convener, are we going to get a third consecutive report on NHS Highland?
I'd be surprised if you didn't. Yes.
Me too. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Auditor General, if I may, before I bring in Mr Sarwar, brokerage. More brokerage has been needed, I think, and will be needed to 2021-22 on the basis of your reports. I think 17.5 million for Highland and 16.8 million for Tayside. Will that be repaid? And if not, can we really say that there was a break-even point in 22?
Committee members are aware that the Cabinet Secretary announced last year that brokerage outstanding as at the end of March this year, 2019, does not have to be repaid. Our current understanding is that brokerage received in future years will still have to be repaid once the board achieves the break-even position. So it's rolled forward until break-even is achieved. But I think there is still the future arrangements for repaying brokerage are not yet entirely clear, and it may be something the committee wants to explore with government.
I understand. Mr Sarwar.
Thank you. Good morning, Auditor General. I wanted to pick up just on the culture part of the NHS Highland report. Obviously, when we were speaking to you last week, we were talking about more widely workforce challenges, cultural challenges. Is that a theme that you're picking up across when you're doing the different reports at the culture and the ongoing staffing pressures and the impact that then having on the relationship between managers and indeed senior clinicians? Is that a recurring theme now right across the NHS and not just isolated to Highland?
Yes, I think the committee will recall that when you took evidence on my report on the NHS in Scotland, one of the themes in there was the pressure on staff and the need for management across the whole NHS, from government through to local leaders, to be really making sure that there is a culture that encourages and supports and gives people space to do the work they're all there to do. That's important in any organisation, but particularly in an organisation like the NHS, which is absolutely about care and about the most personal support any of us will ever need. There were particular issues, I think, in NHS Highland that led to the Cabinet Secretary asking John Sturrock QC to carry out his review. But since that was completed, she has asked all boards to carry out a self-assessment of where they stand against the recommendations in the Sturrock report, and to set out what actions they need to take to make sure people are being supported to carry out their jobs properly.
And in terms of the Sturrock review, the NHS Highland has agreed to implement the findings in full.
I think so, Joe. Do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, so following the Sturrock review, the board pulled together an initial action plan in May this year, which was submitted to the Cabinet Secretary. As a part of that commitment, they are setting up an independent external culture steering group, but they've also done more staff engagement, board development, and been out seeking a lot more views following the initial action plan. So they're going to redo another action plan, but they have committed to implementing the recommendations of that report in full.
Great. And you mentioned, Auditor General, that the Cabinet Secretary has asked all health boards to whether it's their own kind of internal review. How seriously are they taking that? I mean, I can think about Greater Glasgow and Clyde. I can think about a case this morning and the aftermath of that's going to be. I think there are real tensions between those that are involved in leading governance and those that are involved in leading clinical teams, and I don't get the sense that some health boards are taking that seriously. What do we do?
I wouldn't say that boards aren't taking it seriously. I would say that I think it's really difficult. That, as I've reported, on these two boards and the NHS in general, there are real pressures, partly because of financial pressures, partly because of demographic change and the increasing demand that brings with it. People are working incredibly hard, clinicians, but also managers, support staff, all of those people to do the best they can. But that doesn't make it easy, and there are those tensions in a number
I
of
suppose
places.
the question I'm asking is, the way that we had the historic review in Highlands, should there be a similar review that takes place Scotland-wide that is taken out of the hands of the health board who have a vested interest and instead be led independent of the health board and independent of clinicians so that we can really tackle the issues around culture?
I think it's too soon to say that. I think that the self-assessment is a good starting point. The auditors, I point, will be looking as part of their general work on governance at how boards have gone about that. We do hear from individuals from health boards where there are particular concerns, and we follow that up as far as we can. It seems to me that getting culture right is one of those things that has to start within the board. It's very hard to impose it from outside. For me, it's important that there's good governance in place, including staff governance and that concern about the culture, that the staff engagement and communication is working well, and that the whistleblowing checks and balances are in place as well. All of that, I think, is more likely to be successful than it trying to impose things from outside, unless that's the only course that's open.
Thank you. I also noted from the report reference to the locum fees. You'll recall last year that we had the example of almost £500,000 being spent in 1 year on a single locum. I see locum fees have gone up. Again, in the summary, it's paragraph 5, where the locum fees rose from 14.9 million to 15.6 million. Are we seeing anything like similar circumstances where an individual locum is being paid almost £500,000 in a single year?
NHS Highland has faced particular challenges with locums, as you know. Joanne, can you pick that up?
So they have, in terms of those two locums, they've investigated and looked at alternatives around those ones in particular. But locums itself and locum spend is a key part of their transformational programme. And for 1920, they've got in place a number of controls that they didn't necessarily have in previous years. So they've got a target and ceiling rate card for locums. There's a weekly approval panel before locum decisions. And they've looked at doing an exercise of converting long-term agency locums to either fixed or NHS contract locums. And that will obviously help in terms of the financial spend. They still have some challenges given their remote and rural areas in terms of that recruitment, but they are putting controls in place and are, at this point in time, very optimistic that they can see a decline in those costs. But that's something as part of our audit we'll obviously be looking at linked to the financial transformation plans.
And do we know what the highest single payments over to a single locum over the course of a year was this year? Obviously, we know last year was close to the £500,000 mark. Are we aware of what the highest one is this year?
No, but I mean, that's certainly information I can get from the NHS board.
Great, excellent. And I was going to ask a question about NHS Tayside, if that's okay, convener. You referenced the mental health inquiry in the Tayside report. There was obviously some public discussion about this a few weeks ago, where the families again were highlighting a disconnect they felt from the review process, not necessarily with the individuals leading the review, but the way the health board was operating the review and the review process. Have you had any sense about whether that is progressing now, with it seen as a genuine partnership between the families, clinicians and the health board, or whether there's still some tensions and pressures there?
I'm sure there are still some tensions in those very difficult circumstances. It takes a long time to rebuild confidence and trust and ways of working. We say in the report that the NHS Tayside Board now is very focused on wider engagement with the people it serves and doing that in a continuing and consistent way that we haven't seen in the past. I hope that's the sort of thing that will both build confidence and avoid those sorts of problems occurring in future.
And do you have any sense of when the review might publish its final report? Not yet. Any timeline?
No, as far as I'm aware, the board don't know that either.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do members have any further questions? Colin Beattie.
Just one leading on from what I was talking about previously. We discussed the lack of success in NHS Tayside in getting the 2 additional non-executives. I understand there's also been 2 unsuccessful recruitment exercises for the chair. Has that been resolved now, or is that still up in the air?
Yes, a permanent chair has recently been appointed. It's a Professor Nick Beach, who is, I believe, the Vice Principal of the University of Dundee, so he has a business background. So that is a permanent appointment.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from members? In which case, I'd like to thank the Auditor General and colleagues for their evidence this morning, and I now close the public part of this meeting as the committee moves into private session.